My name is Meg Inglis. I'm the Executive Director of the Native Plant Society, and I'd like to introduce to you today Craig Hensley. Craig is going to give a naturalist's guide to the native plants of our local ecoregions presentation. He's a lifelong naturalist and educator. He's been sharing his love and passion for native plants in the natural world for a long time. He's very well known in the Native Plant Society community, as he served as professionally as an interpretive naturalist for more than 30 years, from Iowa to Minnesota to Nebraska, Missouri, and Kansas. And he holds a BS in Fisheries and Wildlife Management and an MS in Zoology. His interests range from birds and butterflies to bees and growing native plants. And for the past nearly 14 years, he's worked for Texas Parks and Wildlife, currently in the role of Texas Nature Trackers Biologist. He's the father to 2 adult children. I didn't know you were old enough to have adult children. And grandpa to 4 granddaughters and 1 grandson. Please welcome Craig Hensley.
Thank you all. Appreciate the opportunity to visit with you today. So when I was asked to do this presentation of native plants of the Balcones, Escarpment and area, there's a lot of them. So I really didn't know where to start. I thought first about just do rare plants, but frankly, I don't have pictures of most of the rare plants because, well, they're rare. So I decided to kind of tailor this. I've been doing a lot of research and my own work on the relationship between pollinators and native plants over the last several years. So I'm going to kind of show you a collection of plants today. Some are going to be more common. Some you might go, why in the world is he showing us that? But there's reasons for each one of these. So I want to share that with you. And hopefully it won't be me on the screen. It'll actually be the slide presentation. There we go. Okay, I was worried about that. And I don't know if there's a way to darken the lights up here a little bit or just make the images maybe a little easier to see for y'all. Hopefully the text is not too small, especially if you're sitting in the back of the room. I'll try to wrap up in time. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask those as well. So to begin with, just in the New Braunfels area, we're kind of, it's kind of a meeting place or a melting pot for 4 different ecoregions. And I'm biased towards the Edwards Plateau because that's where I spend most of my time. So a lot of the plants will reflect that today. If we can get that, there we go. The 4 different ecoregions that are coming up there. I'm going to take this off of here. There we go. Then I can move around a little bit. So you can see we've got 4 different ecoregions that kind of come together there in the New Braunfels area. So there's a little taste of everything here. And if you've done any field trips around the area, you may have seen areas that reflect that variety of places. The one thing I wanted to do, and I know you all are NPSOT members, but I'm amazed how many people I run into that don't know anything about this incredible website you all have. So I made a really short video of how, if you want to learn more about the native plants of this area or any other ecoregion in Texas, so let's see if this will actually play. It may or may not play. Let's see here. There we go. So you're just going to follow my mouse around here. You can see that you can pick your ecoregion, and then you can select on that. You can click there. And then it goes into this massive list of plants, so you can learn all kinds of things, different characteristics, you can sort. And so I wanted to show that with you because I won't say who it is, but my wife didn't even really know about this, and she's a NPSOT member. So please don't tell her I said that if you do know who she is. But it really is an amazing website for really learning more about the native plants where you live. So I decided to do this just to kind of show you what you already have available. So if you already knew about it and have used it, I apologize. If you haven't looked at it that much, I would encourage you to do so. So what I'm going to do today is take a look at certain characteristics of the plants that I'm going to share with you today. And we're going to start with height and perennial versus annual, length of bloom season in our area, and of course that ranges a lot depending on where you live and how much rainfall we get or don't get. Talk about a little bit about how common or rare they might be. I also want to emphasize pollinator value or wildlife value because a lot of these plants don't get the credit they deserve. And then also in terms of availability, I haven't grown all of them, but I've done a lot of growing of native plants and learned some lessons. I'll share a few things, tips there with you there. And we'll talk generally about habitat and then the ecoregions where these plants are found. So let's go ahead and get started. Now I'm going to start with a plant that most of you are going to go, who cares about crow poison? Crow poison, I think, is one of the most beautiful spring wildflowers we have in Texas. And it's very common throughout here. It grows in people's front yards, it grows in their backyards, it grows in the fields, roadside ditches, just about everywhere. So it's a common plant. It grows from a bulb. It is not an onion, although it's related, but if you grab the flowers or the leaves and squeeze them, there will be no onion or garlic-like smell. So that's one way to tell them apart. And the reason I wanted to highlight this one is because in the springtime, when there aren't a lot of blossoms blooming here in the hill country, it turns out, or in this area, it turns out that everything visits these flowers. And this is just a collection of butterfly images that I've taken over the years of things visiting these flowers. They bloom in the spring as soon as it warms up. And then in the fall, if we get some fall rain, it'll bloom a second time. So again, a very important plant. It's only a few inches tall, but I wanted to share that with you because I really do think that this is one of the underappreciated native plants we have here in Texas. And oh, by the way, I've never found anything that tells me that if a crow were to eat this, it would die. Just so you all know. And another one that's these first few are going to be spring flowering plants. And this one, some of you may know, it's celestials, or some people call it prairie pleat leaf. It's again a small plant. A lot of people, if they didn't really know it well, might think it would be blue-eyed grass, which is again very common around here. The picture at the top up there, there we go, right here, you can see blue-eyed grass, the size of the flower versus celestials. It's a really beautiful plant. I've seen it pop up in people's yards. And again, grassy areas. It grows out in the open. It is a favorite of small spring bees, and that's the one thing to keep in mind when you're using native plants, whether it's here or whether it's in Dallas or wherever you're from. That a lot of these small wildflowers in the spring become the most important plants for our early season, mostly solitary nesting bees. And so it's definitely worth one that if you have it, to encourage it. And it, like blue-eyed grass, forms a pod that releases seeds. I've never tried, this is one I've not tried to grow in our area, but it's primarily in our immediate area in the Edwards Plateau, but it does have a wider distribution across Texas. And then I love buttercups. I've seen buttercups wherever I've lived, from Minnesota to Texas, and I happen to love this one the best because it's the largest flowering buttercup in the state. It looks like one of those varieties you see where they've modified a native plant and doubled up the number of petals. Well, this one's got lots of petals, up to 18 petals it can have on its flower. It blooms in the spring. It's a good one for bees to get pollen from. I don't see a lot of butterfly activity on this particular one, but the bees seem to get it, and you can see, as is typical of ranunculus, the genus ranunculus, it has lots and lots of stamens, so lots of pollen there for it. It's one that's going to grow in wetter soils. It tends to grow up and then sprawl, so it might sprawl out 2 or 3 feet depending on how old the plant is. This is one that I was fortunate enough to do a rescue on and grew a couple of them. I've now had them for 5 years, and they come back, and this is one of the ones that starts growing actually in the fall and then overwinters as a small rosette before it starts to bloom in the springtime. And it is mostly central Texas where you're going to find this particular wildflower. And then another one that a lot of people know but may not appreciate as much, I think some of you probably do, frog fruit or fog fruit or whatever you want to call it. And it is not prone to frogs feeding on it or laying their eggs or anything else to do with frogs. But it is a perennial. It's a sprawling perennial. I just happened to be out in West Texas recently at the Devils River State Natural Area South Unit for a BioBlitz. and they had a garden full of this, and you could spend the entire day there photographing pollinators visiting these tiny little flowers. This is a member of the Verbenaceae family, so, and when you look at the flower close up, it's actually a spectacular little tiny flower, white flower with a pinkish purple center. It is one that sprawls, so it's one that if it roots from the above ground stems, you can cut them and plant them. Be patient with them; they will come back with a little bit of watering. And again, the reason I wanted to show you this picture looks a little confusing, but these are all butterflies and pollinators that were landing on a patch of frog fruit in about a 2-hour period. So you've got, just to kind of give you an idea, this guy right here, I'm showing it on the right screen for you. This guy is looks like a wasp. It's actually a moth that's a mimic of wasps called the Texas wasp moth. And curiously enough, it is so good a mimic that I've watched yellow jackets, which are predatory wasps, avoid that moth, which it could eat very easily, and they stay away from it because it's such a good mimic. And then we've got over here on this side, you've got a fly that looks again like a bee or a wasp. And then of course all these different butterflies, and here's another day flying moth right here, that little fellow right there. So again, this is a plant that a lot of people would go, well, yeah, I've got some frog fruit, but if you're looking for something to put in a yard setting or on the edge setting, frog fruit, you can't go wrong, and it grows really well around here. There are 3 species statewide. This is Notiflora. This is the most common one. And then one of the taller spring wildflowers, and you'll see these on roadsides, but because the flower heads are the individual flowers are so small, even though it's a plant that can get to 3.5 feet, a lot of people don't even realize it's outgrowing in roadside ditches around central Texas and other parts of the state. But Texas prairie parsley, as it turns out, at least in my yard in Bernie, is the plant that every little bee and wasp goes to in the early spring. The flowers are very tiny, but you can see here's an example, that rounded picture right there, 3 different kinds of bees and wasps coming to that one flower head. They're coming in there not so much for the nectar, but for the little bit of pollen they get. And because there's so many flowers, they can visit it over and over and over again. So when this blooms in the spring, again, for these small bees and wasps that are just starting out in the spring, this becomes a super important plant for them to survive. And so when I talk about, and that's why when I talk about native plants, I always try to bring in the pollinators, because those things, it's nice to have the beautiful native plants themselves, but what are they doing for the rest of the natural world around you? And so it's worth observing and seeing how things are using these. I've grown this from seed. They've produced lots of big flat seeds. But the problem is they have a big old taproot, and I've grown them. I had 2-year-old plants that were literally 1.5 inches tall with about 1.5 feet of root. So they're really slow growing. So getting them to survive, you got to be very patient with it, and also plant the seeds in a deep pot, because again, they don't just jump out of the ground like some things do. And then another one I wanted to show you that's a spring, then we'll move on from here. This is one of our woodland, I like to think of it as an open woodland plant, native plant, called false gromwheel or marble seed. It's a fantastic plant. It is visited in the springtime when there's almost nothing else blooming in bottomland woodland forests, by hummingbirds, things like monarch butterflies, bumblebees. Everything is visiting these flowers. The flowers themselves, I think, are kind of neat looking because they're so different. Some people describe them as Japanese lanterns. But the flower itself is closed. It hangs upside down. As you can see there, that white thing stabbing out of the middle of it is actually the pistil. And the stamens are actually on the inside of rim of or inside the petals, the closed petals. And apparently it's a good nectar producer because things go to it like crazy. And It grows in the Edwards Plateau. There's at least one other species that grows here. That one down in the lower right-hand corner is actually an endemic to the Edwards Plateau. Heller's marble seed, or Heller's Cromwell, that is much less common than we have around here. And the reason I'm hoping this will play, you can see there's a large bumblebee. This is in the spring. This was at Honey Creek State Natural Area a few years ago. And I watched this bumblebee nectaring and feeding on this marble seed, and we'll see if it plays. And this is not a professional video, by the way, so bear with it. There's a little bouncing around, but what's happening is those pistils that are sticking on the outside of the flower is coming in contact with the belly of that bumblebee. Well, the bumblebee is a big insect, obviously. This is a queen, just emerged from her overwintering. And so she's in there strong enough to push her head through the opening of the flower, drink the nectar, and if you'll start to notice, her belly and the bottom of her abdomen start getting white. And if you'll also notice, did you see that little dust of powder? So that is pollen flying out of the pistil or the stamens on the inside of those flowers. And this is where you're really going to see it. But what's really cool about this flower, this plant, and why I like it so much, not only does it have these white, super hard, marble-like seeds, this thing, look at that. I just love it. I can watch this all day long. And the funny part about this is when I actually filmed this, I had no idea what was going on until I played the video on the computer. I didn't know the pollen was flying all over. So this plant is getting pollinated by the bumblebee itself, and because the pollen falls on its belly, it goes to the next flower, the pistil contacts it, and then, just for grins, it's throwing pollen all over the place so that maybe it can be wind pollinated too. So again, this is one of those plants that a lot of people, you're not going to find it commercially available. You can, if you get a chance to, somebody find some, or you want to dig some or whatever legally. It does grow underground roots, and you can cut those off. It takes a little bit in a pot. I always put them in a pot in my little patch in the yard, and grow them up, so that it takes a little while for them to recover, but once it happens, it's pretty good. So anyway, I just wanted to share that with you. So now we're going to move on a little bit later in the year. There's lots of different kinds of penstemons across the state of Texas, but one of the most, I think, I'm probably biased, most beautiful ones we have is this guy right here, the scarlet penstemon, or Heller's beard tongue. Beautiful reddish flowers, grows April through May, and it grows and is done, and when it's done, it's done. And then it takes months for the seeds to ripen in very hard capsules. The most common one that we have around here is that cobea right there, Penstemon cobea, but it's got a bigger flower and more of a pale pink to almost white. But these Triflorus is just a great plant. Bumblebees and other small bees love the penstemons. So if you have native penstemons in your yard in the spring, you're going to see a lot of bee activity. I don't see many butterflies or moths using it, but big bees and small bees that can actually use those lines that go into the flower, those nectar guides, to follow that all the way to the base of the flower, get the nectar. When they crawl out, one of the things you'll notice is that the pistils and the pistils out here on the edge, the stamens are out here on the edge, brushes against the passing insect to help spread the pollen. But very easy to grow from seed. Once you've germinated it, though, it takes a little longer than cobea and some of the other ones, so you have to be a little bit patient with it. It'll be at least a couple of years before you might get it to flower. And then most of us are familiar with widow's tears. This guy right here, there's different species of that, but the one that I like the best is the one that looks like a face. It is an annual plant. It doesn't spread like some of those other day flowers that spread across the ground and drop, roots go all over the place. They are annuals, but they do create colonies, but they're easy to manage because you can pull those up and you're done with it if it gets out of hand. I'm not familiar with what kind of wildlife it has. I'm guessing because of the arrangement of the flower, it's probably more for small bees or flies that would visit this particular flower. But I happen to like it because it gives some really interesting color and shape in the early spring in this particular part of the state, and it's mostly in the Edwards Plateau. And then when we talk about another one coming on a little bit later, the narrow-leaf coneflower, which is Echinacea angustifolia, everybody is familiar with purple coneflower. Purple coneflower, turns out, is only found in one county in the state as listed as native. So it is native to Texas, but we all know that it's planted in gardens all over the place. It's a great butterfly plant. This is one of our native species that is also very good for butterflies, for bees of all kinds. When it's blooming, it's a taller plant than purple coneflower. Unfortunately, this one has disappeared a lot around here as our native prairies have disappeared, so it's a little harder to find. You might find it in some more undisturbed roadside ditches. One of the neat things about this one, there's another one called Echinacea pallida, which grows mostly farther north in the Dallas and up in that area, part of the state. But you'll notice on this one, you have to look really close, but this one has yellow pollen, and pallida has white pollen. So if you find these in the northern part of the state where both of them can grow, you can actually find, you can tell the difference maybe a little by the leaves, but you can certainly look at the pollen and see which one is which. Relatively easy to grow from seed. Treat the seeds that you would with all of the others, but unlike purple coneflower, which grows much faster from seed, that one will take a couple of years. Now, giving a wildflower presentation and showing a thistle, fortunately nobody's throwing anything at me, which is good, because this is a native thistle. And one of the things that I find when I'm talking to people out there that don't know, the unwashed, if you will, they think all thistles are bad. And it turns out that the Texas thistle is a great plant for pollinators, especially large ones. I get a lot of different kinds of butterflies, as you can see there, bumblebees. But the other thing I've noticed is a lot of very tiny, tiny solitary bees, native bees, use this plant all the time because on that one flower head are literally hundreds of individual flowers. Because it is a composite, it's all concentrated in one place. So there's a lot of value to this plant. It's kind of a short-lived biennial. I've actually dug a couple of up from a roadside ditch and put them in my yard. They did not come back the second year. They died off, but I found a couple of new rosettes. So if you don't stagger them, you won't have them every year. Do they spread? Certainly they can spread. They're a thistle, but not like bull thistle and some of the other non-natives that we have. But I find this to be one of the more valuable plants in our area when it's blooming April through July. And then we have a couple of red flowers that are found here quite commonly and are actually great garden plants, native plants. Tropical sage, of the two, tropical sage is the easiest to grow and will spread much more easily or quicker than cedar sage does. The nice thing about the tropical sage, it is a favorite of hummingbirds. My yard right now has probably 30 or 40 of these plants scattered around. I planted 3 or 4 years ago, and they've done their thing. They produce tiny little dark black seeds that goldfinches eat. They'll actually be in the dried flower stems, pulling the seeds out of those. So not only are they feeding hummingbirds, they're feeding goldfinches, and other things that come to this include the bees, including bumblebees. But if you've ever seen those yellow butterflies flying around, the sulfurs love red flowers. And so you'll see a variety of sulfurs feeding on this as well as Gulf fritillaries. Cedar, and it grows in shade too. That's the other thing. It's a good shade-loving native. And then cedar sage is also a shade lover. Unlike, I always thought that cedar sage, you had to have cedars around them. Turns out you don't. They grow well. They don't spread as fast. They don't grow as fast, but I've grown it from seed as well. And again, it feeds hummingbirds and sulfurs. The best way to tell the difference when it's not blooming is the leaf of tropical sage is a point, and this one on cedar sage is more rounded, more crenately shaped. So those are two beautiful red flowers that you can use that grow here in the hill country and other scattered areas. And then, of course, we can talk milkweeds all day because there's over 60 species of milkweed in the state of Texas. The one I chose to highlight, or one of two, is butterfly milkweed, which is a native prairie plant. So this was back in the day when the state was covered with more prairie. This would have been a very common, very prevalent native plant. It gets a lot of attention because there's another non-native milkweed called tropical milkweed that looks similar, but it really doesn't. It's much taller, it's a different color, but everybody thinks, and it gets called butterfly weed. So this is the native one. It doesn't grow, it only grows about 2 feet tall, maybe 2.5 feet tall. Generally, it is a plant with it's a long-lived plant. It has those brilliant orange flowers. Unlike most milkweeds, when you pull a leaf, it does not bleed milky sap, which can be misleading maybe for some people. But it's mostly going to be found in undisturbed prairies, but it's becoming more and more common in the garden industry. But again, it gets lumped in with tropical milkweed, which gets called this plant, so that there can be some confusions. Monarchs do, in fact, use it. One thing to keep in mind with all of our milkweeds, we always talk about milkweeds in terms of monarch butterflies, and of course queens use them as well. But what's really valuable besides the monarch and the queen, every pollinator on God's green earth uses milkweed flowers when they're blooming. I mean, everyone. If you go and watch, in the lower picture you see there asperula, which is antelope horn milkweed. If you go to a milkweed flower in the springtime and watch what's going on for an hour, you'll be amazed at how many things visit those flowers. They are really, really valuable for a lot of our pollinators and even non-pollinators. Remember, this one's probably a little more difficult to pollinate because the pollen isn't in individual little bits and pieces. It comes in pollinia, little sacs of pollen, so it has to be pulled out of the flower by the bee's leg or foot or whatever, and then get transported. It's a whole story I don't have time to go into. Just to say, really, really valuable plant that does grow in our area. And then an endemic milkweed that we have here in the Edwards Plateau, including near here, is the Texas milkweed. Interesting plant. It's endemic in Texas. It's found in the Edwards Plateau and then in Big Bend, nowhere in between, which is kind of odd. But beautiful white flowers. It's a shade-loving milkweed, so you can grow it in shaded areas. Of all the milkweeds I've tried to grow personally, this one germinates the best, and in the first year it will produce flowers on some of the plants. It's more of a sprawly plant, but really nice. I watched some at the Cibolo Nature Center where my office is this spring when it was in full bloom, and lots and lots of different kinds of, again, pollinators were visiting this particular wildflower. And then another plant that might not get the attention I think it deserves is Texas skeleton plant. This is a plant that's going to start blooming in March, and it's still blooming right now. It only blooms for a couple of days, and then it turns into those like dandelion seed heads. It's relatively easy to grow from seed when those seeds are ripe and you've treated them. Open fields and roadsides. And what's really one of the interesting characteristics of this flower, each one of these are an individual flower here called ray flowers. They don't have any disc flowers. But a lot of the butterflies that feed on it are skippers like these two guys right here, and they don't land in the flower. They actually sit outside, use their long proboscis to get to the pollen, so they're not effective, or the nectar, they're not effective pollinators. So it takes beetles and other things. The problem with this beetle right here, once he lands on one of those flowers, or she eats the entire thing. So it might have pollinated it, but instead it chooses to eat the entire thing. And so I literally watched for 2 hours as one of these beetles devoured one of these flowers. And, well, I won't even talk about the pooping machine it became as a result of that. It was pretty amazing stuff. But this is, again, a flower. I have all kinds of videos of pipeline swallowtails and other butterflies feeding on this. So again, one that doesn't get a lot of attention. It doesn't have much for leaves. It's called skeleton plant for a reason. It does a lot of its photosynthesis through its green stems. But again, I think a spectacular plant before it opens, after it opens, and even in fruit. And then if I always include mealy blue sage, even though I'm sure everyone in the room knows this plant. and it grows all over large parts of the state of Texas. But if I was going to use a native plant, if I was going to recommend a native plant to somebody that was going to attract the most pollinators and bloom for the longest period of time and that was easy to grow, it would be Mealy blue sage. Because it blooms multiple times during a given season. It's pretty drought tolerant. We've been living in drought for 3 years in Bernie, and my plants are still alive. Sometimes I don't know how. But they're still producing flowers. Beautiful plant. In other parts of the state, there are other salvias that would do very well as well. I've been able to grow this in full sun and in partial shade. Most of my yard is partial shade, and it seems to do okay right there as well. So again, something that very common but very valuable when you go to the bigger picture. Now, one of the plants that isn't found everywhere in the state of Texas is this guy, woolly ironweed. Beautiful plant. That particular photograph, those plants were 3 feet tall and growing straight out of rock here in the hill country. In fact, only a few miles from here where I took that picture. Most of you know what an ironweed is. Sometimes certain species, Baldwinii, other species can become very invasive, spread around a lot. This one doesn't tend to spread very much. The other thing that's what's interesting is this particular native plant will cross-pollinate with Baldwinii and form a recognized separate species called Guadalupiensis that has a leaf that's intermediate in width between the two parent species. It grows only on caliche soils except in my yard, which has no caliche soil. Maybe one of the only yards in Texas without caliche soil, I don't know. But it does very well. It blooms for an extended period of time. It's very easy to germinate the seeds. Getting them to persist over the course of a summer in a pot becomes a real challenge. It's better with this one if you're going to grow them, get them germinated, get them in the ground, and let them fight it out there, because the longer they stay in the pots, the worse they seem to do. I don't know what that is. And then there's lots of goldenrods. Right now, if you drive around this area, you're going to see this particular goldenrod in full bloom on all the rocky soils, on the roadside ditches, on the little rocky banks. And this is prairie or gray goldenrod. Grows normally about 2 feet tall in caliche soil. In my yard, it grows 3.5 feet tall, but it gets too leggy. It almost starts to turn into Canada goldenrod or some of the other ones that are out there. But it really likes the rocky soils. If you're looking for something and you've got some rocky soils, gather the seeds up in the fall, and they're easy to germinate and grow in a flat, and then you can spread them out. They'll bloom sometimes the first year, but a lot of times it'll take 2 years to get them to bloom for you. And we all know Greg's blue mistflower, or Greg's mistflower, because it's in every garden everywhere. But our native one that we have here and into parts of East Texas and a little bit farther north and west is our blue mistflower. When you look at the two, you compare the two, this one's called dissectum for a reason. The leaves are very highly dissected, whereas this one has more of a triangular shaped leaf. This one tends to want to grow in wetter areas, so where there's a little bit more moisture. But like dissectum, like Greg's blue mist, it attracts a lot of pollinator activity in the fall when it's blooming. But you're going to find it along open woodland edges, wet or moist areas. It's not everywhere. I've even seen this growing in full shade situations along creeks. So it is very well adapted to a variety of growing conditions. But unlike Greg's blue mist, it is not, I don't find it ever available in the market, but it's one that I like to promote because it's truly native. Greg's mistflower is actually more native to West Texas, but it's highly adapted to growing in so many of our places that it's such a valuable plant. If you can't find this one, certainly Greg's mistflower will suffice. And then I'll show these two only because it's fall, and fall is the best time to enjoy these two species, even though the yellow one, cowpen daisy, actually is an annual that starts blooming in spring and goes all the way through fall to frost. They're related, they're same genus. Frostweed is the big perennial, and let me tell you, I'll just tell you right now, if you grow you get some frostweed and put it in your yard, 2 years from now, you will not hardly be able to dig it out without a backhoe because the root structure on that thing is massive. Whereas cowpen, you can pull it out of the ground at any time of the year because it's an annual and it doesn't have very deep roots. But both of these are favorites of migrating monarchs in the fall. In our area, when the monarchs do come through, these can be critically important to them. And then when the monarchs aren't around, these are really important to lots of different kinds of pollinators. So again, you've got a perennial versus an annual. They both can spread a little bit because of the nature of the beast. But they're both worth having if you're looking for something in the fall that's a taller plant. Now, I will tell you that in the drought, in August, frostweed looks like death warmed over. Because all those great big leaves turn brown and they hang down like the plant's about to die. And then it gets a little bit of rain and all of a sudden it puts on a flower head and it's fantastic. So if you're looking for pretty, all the time pretty, that might not be the best choice. But I am a huge advocate for both of these wildflowers. And then I'm going to show you, just to wrap up, I'm going to show you a couple of vines. Lindheimer's Morning Glory, there's lots of Morning Glories in the state. This is one of the most beautiful ones, huge flower. You can see the shape of the leaf, even the leaf is gorgeous. It's got a limited distribution in Texas and it's kind of scattered because it grows mostly along the ground out in open areas. But the flower only opens for a few hours each day. Individual flowers. You can grow them by seed. You got to do the winter treatment kind of thing. It may take 2 or 3 years for you to get them to grow. Its cousin, which actually now goes by a whole different genus, right here, Alamo vine, is one that looks very, seed heads or seed pods look very similar. Flowers only last for a day. These have, by the way, these have specific bees that pollinate these flowers that are specialists on these type of flowers. But the Alamo vine seeds grow a lot faster. That's probably because they're more common. Who knows? Who knows what that relationship is? And spreads like crazy. So be careful with that one. But I still like it and grow it. So, and then we have a lot of people are familiar with the pearl milkweed, but we have here in the hill country the endemic plateau milk vine. Flowers look very much alike. However, if you look here, this one's got the little pearl in the center. This one lacks the pearl. Then the venation on the individual petals is a little bit different as well. But it's very uncommon. I've only seen it in a few places. It's actually considered an SGCN, or Species of Greatest Conservation Need, by Texas Parks and Wildlife, found primarily in wooded areas. And then this one, oh my goodness. Most of you are probably familiar with purple leather flower. This is scarlet leather flower, another Edwards Plateau endemic. Beautiful flowers, blooms in the springtime, fairly uncommon to rare. You got to get lucky to find it, and you usually find it because it's flowering, and that flower is pretty darn dramatic. Typically along waterways, whether it's along the edge of a lake, a wooded lake, or a wooded stream is where I typically find them. I have grown them from seed. It took 2 years for the seeds to germinate. I put the seeds in a 5-gallon pot, kept it watered, and just walked away. Germinated in 2 years. It took 2 years. Then finally this year, I talked to one of our real plant growing experts over there in Bernie. I said, what should I do? He goes, just let them go. And I'm like, oh, I can't. I got to see what's going on. So I turned over that 5-gallon pot. The root, the plant stem, the plant itself, the longest one was about 3 inches long with about 2 or 3, I think maximum 3 pairs of leaves. Again, 2-year-old plants. Roots were 1.5 feet to 2 feet. So you have to be very patient with this particular flower plant. It grows very, very slowly, which probably indicates why it's not real common everywhere, perhaps. And then I want to share one shrub that's getting ready to bloom or is blooming now in the hill country, especially in this area. This is Shrubby boneset, Agritina havanensis. It is by far, in the fall, in this area, the best, most attractive pollinator plant out there in our landscape. It will attract everything. I've literally sat in a chair in front of one and spent hours photographing all the different pollinators. It's a beautiful shrub. It's a long living. I've got some now that are 5 years old. And they were older than that when I got them, obviously, so probably 6 years old. And the nice thing about them is this is a shrub that has you can form a nice shape with it, so it's a great one for people that want to have a little bit more traditional garden. It blooms in the fall. This year it bloomed in the spring because we got a lot of rain this spring before drought turned in again. And it's just beautiful. So if you're familiar with it, advocate for it. It's a great one. It's more of an Edwards Plateau type plant, but it's becoming more and more widely recognized as a valuable pollinator plant. And then just because you're the Native Plant Society, I thought I would show you one rare plant. I don't know much about it because I've only seen it once at Pedernales Falls State Park along a creek at night when I was trying to catch bats. And this is chatterbox orchid, beautiful plant, 3 feet tall. Again, I don't know much about it, but it's an orchid and it's a rare plant, and there you go. So now you can walk away and say that I shared one rare plant in the hill country for you. And then I also want to recommend, you guys have a big BioBlitz coming up towards the end of October. Right now, in fact, yesterday we started the Texas Pollinator BioBlitz through Texas Parks and Wildlife. And this was as of this morning, we've already had 1,000 species documented. So if you go out into your gardens and you take pictures of your native plants and the pollinators are on them using iNaturalist, it'll automatically load into this project and you can help kind of grow this event. And that'll lead very nicely into your BioBlitz that y'all are going to do in relationship with TPWD as well at the end of the month. All right. There we are.